So today, the two speakers are Dan Marks joining us from London and Professor Koichiro Tanaka from Tokyo, and I'll very briefly introduce them. So Professor Koichiro Tanaka teaches at Keio University's Graduate School of Media and Governance, and he teaches Middle Eastern politics and energy security. And he's also an extraordinary advisor to the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and a well-known commentator on Japanese TV on these kind of issues. He has long experience as a Middle Eastern expert, both at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at the UN Special Mission to Afghanistan, and also at the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. And then our moderator today is Dan Marks. He is a research fellow in energy security at RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, where he leads the energy and security program. And so he looks at the national security angles of energy markets and also at the energy transition internationally and in the UK. He's previously worked on African energy issues, and his Middle Eastern expertise includes an MA in international relations in the Middle East. And at this point, I will hand over to Dan and leave it all to him.
Hi, thanks for that. So great to be speaking to you all, and thanks for inviting me to moderate. I'm going to very quickly hand over to Professor Tanaka for the presentation, and then we'll have some question and answer afterwards. So Professor Tanaka.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Dan and Jason, sorry. Nice to be here. Hello, everybody. It's already like 9 in the evening here in Japan, Tokyo. I believe, although people in London are now about to go for the lunch break. Now, I've got like 20 minutes for my presentation, so I'll just quickly run through the global issues. But first of all, I'd like to give you sort of an idea of where we stand when it comes to energy security and energy question in Japan. Now, let me share a slide to tell you how the presentation is going to look like. Next slide. Okay, the issues that I'm going to talk about is like outlined here. Major points, 5 major points, and that will be the entire thing. There's only one other slide which I will use later, but these are the issues that I'm going to cover in my presentation. Now, when it comes to Japan's energy security question, there are several, say, aspects and characteristics that people should understand from the very beginning. The first thing is that the self-sufficiency ratio of Japan in its energy supplies is extremely low, roughly 11% at the year of 2021. And it is not likely to increase or recover anytime soon because of the issues that we have with the nuclear power plants here in Japan following the Fukushima incident of 2011. Now, there is also a heavy reliance on imported hydrocarbon resources, which amounts to over 90%, whether 90% of it each, whether take it from coal, natural gas, or oil. And especially when it comes to oil, our dependency on Middle East oil is above 95%, which is extremely, extremely high in any other cases that you can find elsewhere. Now, we have to move this oil out from the Persian Gulf region to Japan in the Far East or Far East. And for that matter, we need this to secure the sea lane, which is done mostly by the United States Naval Forces. And we have to thank about that because they are there to provide security for our energy supplies. Now, the other aspect that we need to look into is that Japan, you know that Japan is an archipelago, and we are totally isolated from any, say, neighbors or our neighbors. And we are not connected with pipelines, be it gas or oil, and we are not even connected with power grids with our neighbors. So Japan is a totally isolated issue here. So it means that we have to provide ourselves when it comes to energy. I mean, meaning importation is mostly what it is, but still we need to think of our own selves. Now, the other part is that there's a strong opposition and skepticism over the use of nuclear power plants following the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi incident, and that still remains. Although in the current years, I mean, the past 2 years or so, the Japanese public has gradually been shifting away from the opposition and has become slightly more, say, welcoming the rebooting of existing nuclear power plants here in Japan. And the last thing is that the island is divided into two, mostly east and west, by the difference of the frequency of the electricity current. The eastern part of Japan runs with 50 hertz. The western part of Japan runs under 60 hertz. And there's sort of a disconnect between the two regions, east and west. So that is one of the characteristics that you have to know when we talk about energy security here in Japan. Now, the second term is the sources of concern that we share with a lot of states, including UK and others, is that we are affected by a lot of issues and conflicts that occur here and there, mostly in the Middle East, because we are heavily reliant on oil the Middle East. And back in 1973, we all remember 50 years ago that the fourth round of Arab-Israeli conflict had the so-called Yom Kippur War have resulted in the OPEC oil embargo, as well as the price raise by the OPEC countries. And that has caused a major shock to our economy. And we are really, really afraid and concerned that it may happen again under some certain conditions and circumstances. In 1979, we observed the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And again, Iran had, tried to decrease its oil exports to major Western countries, and we were affected again by that. But even more, from 1980 to 88, the war between Iraq and Iran has led to a total chaotic situation in and around the Persian Gulf region. And we were quite, concerned that the war of tankers would hamper the exportation or importation from the side of Japan from the region of the oil flowing out from the Persian Gulf region. Of course, there was no major serious incident that did actually stop the flow out from the flow of oil out from the Persian Gulf, but still the uncertainties that existed did have a impact on our economy. Now, the 1991 Gulf War again was a concern that the instability may spread across the region. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but years later or decades later, the 2022 Russian invasion on Ukraine actually did have an impact here. Of course, for the Europeans, I believe that it is nonsense to talk about it because you have suffered much more than we did. But even here in Japan, we are now importing over 95% of oil from the Middle East, as I said earlier. The only one reason that it happened was that we had to curtail and also stop our importation of oil from Russia, which constituted roughly 5% of our total imports. So that made the final push to exceed the threshold of 90%. And not to forget, the LNG supplies from Russia, which still today continues, is a major issue for us. Now, we are relying roughly 10% of our LNG imports from the Sakhalin-2 project that the Japanese companies and also the government, in a sense, has a stake in it. And if the United States and G7 countries are to move further to place the Russian LNG facilities under sanctions, I believe that it's going to have a major impact on us. And hopefully that won't, but still that is a possibility. And also the Japanese have been investing heavily on the Arctic 2 LNG project, and that in recent days have now come under scrutiny and is now placed under sort of the sanctions by the United States and others. Now we're trying to figure out whether the war in Gaza that is ongoing, and we're just seeing whether it's going to be sort of a pause in the hostilities, at least for several days or now, may have a similar impact on us or not. Now, the issue is that it's not that we are dependent on Israeli natural gas or any other oil from that part of the world. But still, if the war is to spread across the region, then we might be well under, say, pressure to find other, say, external sources to divert our, say, energy supplies from, divert our reliance on the region to somewhere else, which isn't that easy given the conditions that we are facing with Russia and also with other countries as well. So that is about the conditions that we are now facing. But what about us? I mean, it's not like 1973. One thing is for sure. Back in 1973, we were at panic. We were at shock. We panicked. And that had led Japan to, say, consider a lot of things in its own policy for the future. And we are now well prepared, more than ever, in the compared to those days at least. Now, we reduced the share of oil as a source of primary energy here in Japan. Back in 1973, 2/3 of our primary energy source was oil. Today, it's down to 1/3. So it is decreased significantly. Of course, it was taken over by LNG and others, but still, dependency on oil has reduced significantly. Now, here in Japan, we still import a major amount of, huge amount of oil from the oil producers in the Middle East, but the amount has significantly decreased also. Around 30 years ago, in the mid-1990s, Japan was importing 4.67 million barrels of oil per day in those days. Okay, that was the height of the oil imports for Japan. Now, today in 2023, it is down to merely 2.6 million barrels per day. So there's a significant decrease in the amount of Japan importing its own oil from the Middle East countries. The other part is that we now have the strategic oil reserve to play as a buffer if something goes really wrong and to alleviate the shocks that may occur, which didn't exist back in 1973. So here in Japan, we are much well prepared than we used to in the past. Then also, if we look at how the Middle East oil producers are acting in these days, we do see a similar change. I mean, not similar to us, but a change that has occurred over the decades. Now, there's sort of a lack of coherence among the OPEC members, although they unite themselves along with Russia and others to form the OPEC Plus to, well, challenge us or to try to, say, provide some sort of a breathing space when the oil prices are on its oil prices are on its decline. Now, so far, we have seen that sort of the past 3 years work in their favor, but well, still, if they're not as coherent as they used to be back in the 1970s. And of course, back in the 70s, the major oil importers from the Middle East were Western states, OECD and Western states. Now, the major importers of oil are here in East Asia, meaning China, Japan, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, and also South Asia, like India. So if the Middle East oil producers are to curtail their oil exports based on some ideological or political judgment, then those who are to suffer are not the West. Rather, it's going to end up in harming their relationship with a country like China or India, who are the major stakeholders of the future energy demand. So it will not work. It is unlikely that it will work in their favor. So there are a lot of things that have changed ever since 1973. So we could be relaxed in a sense about that. But yet there is one major problem, which is not about oil, but about natural gas, LNG. And we've already witnessed that the Tamar offshore oil, gas field run by the Americans and the Israelis in joint venture has shut down its activities ever since October 7th, the day when the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad had staged a terrorist attack against the the Israelis. Okay, so now the gas is not flowing into first of all to Israel, but more to Egypt, where the LNG facilities were run by that run by that natural gas, and then subsequently was exported as LNG to the Mediterranean and beyond, and also to Asia as well. So the shortage of natural gas or the LNG in the market may strike sort of a alarming bell if the winter in the northern hemisphere of this year and towards the next year would be a severe one. Here in Japan, we are foreseeing that it won't be a harsh winter, but if the freeze is really going to hit the Western European states, I believe the shortage of LNG supplies may have a major role. And the most recent incident by the Houthi movement or the Ansarullah movement in Yemen that has, well, hijacked or seajacked a commercial vessel near the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. And if that sort of a trade route is to be, say, controlled by these elements that are not totally friendly to us or to any Western state, then the flow of LNG out from a state like Qatar towards Western Europe may also come under scrutiny and may have a significant negative impact on the coming winter. So having said that, what are we trying to do here in Japan about the energy structure or the strategy for the future? Is that, okay, we have signed the Paris Agreement. We are trying to adhere ourselves and commit ourselves to the the carbon neutrality by 2050. And we consider that that will be impossible to achieve without rebooting the nuclear power reactors here in Japan. We have also, well, announced that we will reduce the GHG emission by 40% compared to 2013 by the year 2030, which is only 6 years away from today. And we are gradually moving towards that, but it's not clear whether we can make it or not. Again, it requires a significant amount of, well, effort by the government and as well as the local government and the populace to come to an agreement to reboot the nuclear power reactors. Now, the Strategic Energy Policy of 2021, the 6th edition, which I'm going to show you now, talks about the, well, sort of a energy mixture with the target year of 2030. I took this from the government website. It's not that well formatted. It's not that easy to understand what it means. But those in the bold on the right-hand side would tell you that we are going to heavily rely on renewable energy by 2030, 36 or 38% of it. And still, the nuclear energy would come next, roughly 20% or so, accustomed by the 20% of LNG and so on and so forth. So whether we will be able to achieve the goal, targeted goal or not, is still reliant on, first of all, the renewable energies that we are trying to introduce here in Japan, solar PVs, also offshore windmills or wind farms that are coming in stream. And these are the reliance that we're trying to, say, lean onto. Now, the significant reduction in coal and LNG is foreseen, but whether we can achieve that or not, we still need to see whether our, well, commitments will stand by so. Now, the basic strategy for realization of green transformation, this is a long title, but this was recently also announced in 2023, And we also again emphasize on the reliance on both the renewables and the nuclear power reactors, NPRs. And associated with that, we now have this basic hydrogen strategy. You can see hydrogen and ammonia only constitute like 1% during the year of 2030, but we are trying to develop that in a way that by using liquefied hydrogen and MCH and ammonia as the transport carriers of hydrogen. But that is for the years or the decades to come. Now, I'm running short of time, so I would just like to conclude here that what to expect and what kind of a challenge lies ahead is that, are we able to reboot the NPRs, or are we able to rely on the new generation NPRs that are now under development? Now, the most recent development that we heard from the United States was that the project that they have been trying to achieve or to complete for the SMRs, the small modular reactors, have failed. And that is going to have a real, say, stunning effect on us, because the government was trying to introduce that here locally in Japan, if they were to be successful. Now, we may have to rethink about that. And also the current the existing nuclear reactors are aging, and some are failed, as we have seen during the Fukushima incident. So we don't have adequate numbers of NPRs that may be functionable not only for the year 2030, but even beyond 2050. Now, the government have adjusted its policies in the recent month, and now we are going to extend the lifetime or the life cycle of nuclear power plants from 40 years to 60 years, and even beyond 60 years. But even by doing that, we still are going to run short of nuclear power plants when the year 2050 arrives. So beyond that, it is totally nothing. I mean, we can't foresee beyond 2050 what is going to happen. Now, as I said earlier, during the past 2 years, the Japanese populace or the population has become relatively softer towards nuclear power reactors than they used to, compared to the earlier years following the Fukushima incident. But that has come only because mostly in the eastern part of Japan for the past 2 years, we have had sort of a power shortage for the areas surrounding Tokyo and the Tohoku area where the Fukushima power plants used to work over there. Now, then people started thinking that, okay, we need to reboot, we need to rely more on nuclear power. And that made a major shift. And then the government followed on that sort of a trail. And then they have announced that they would, not only reboot the existing power plants more vigorously, but even that they would, construct new power plants and also replace the aging reactors. But that needs to be seen again, because it takes decades or even several decades for a nuclear power plant to become operational. Now, the last point I like to make is that, okay, now we are trying to introduce a new set of energy, like hydrogen, as we mentioned before. But even under this green transformation, GX program, that the government of Prime Minister Kishida is so keen on developing, are we able to, preserve that as sort of a strategy, or to use that as a strategy to maintain our own national security, not only by increasing the level of energy self-sufficiency, or would it be able to be used to, use them under circumstances such as war? I mean, we are not aiming for war, but if things go wrong, totally wrong in East Asia, we may end up in sort of a war kind situation either with People's Republic of China or possibly with DPRK. And if that sort of an incident occurs, then are we able to run the country and economy as well as our self-defense forces under the new green transformation strategy? Now, that is not totally incorporated. That was not incorporated under the 3 national security documents that was released about a year ago. So I'm a little bit concerned how the Japanese government is trying to incorporate the green transformation strategy to the national security issues that lies ahead. So I will stop here, and sorry that I may have exceeded my time limit, and I will like to have sort of discussion with you and also try to answer as well as much as I can to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tanaka, for a very interesting, bit ropey during that presentation. So if I drop out all of a sudden, I will probably be back in a minute, but there are questions in the chat at least to keep things going. So now, yeah, as I mentioned, there's a few questions coming in the chat, so feel free to add some there and raise your hand if you want to ask a question specifically. I have a few questions just to start off. And I wanted to start with actually a bit of a comparison with the UK and to get your view on the differences in how the UK and Europe handle energy security and Japan manages energy security in oil and gas. So specifically that Japan has a tendency to sign much more long-term contracts. With the UK and Europe tend to rely on spot markets, short-term contracts. This has, well, resulted in kind of much higher prices in 2022 in the UK and Europe for gas, but on the other hand, may mean that they're less exposed to particular regions, because if one region has a problem, you just buy from another region, and you know, so you have some more diversity potentially. So I was wondering if you could just dig a little bit into the differences and perhaps draw out a few kind of each other in terms of what's worked and what hasn't worked so well.
All right. Well, thanks for the question. Well, yes, definitely that is true that Japanese oil importers and gas importers rely on long-term contracts. And that was sort of an idea that was, well, prevailing for the past years, at least. But I believe that the Japanese LNG importers have shifted away from long-term contracts, especially with a country like Qatar, which we had a long-term contract until the end of 2021, December 2021. But we terminated the contract, or at least the contract was not renewed. And then we now end up with, well, buying more LNG from the spot market than we used to. So the conditions, well, I mean, there was a natural condition or a reason of why we shifted away from the long-term contract with a country like Qatar, because simply they were imposing more conditions on the style of, and also the volume of the LNG imports that we buy, that we take. And that was not so convenient for us. And we thought at least the importers considered that they would have more flexibility now that there will be pretty much a good amount of LNG for the spot market in the years to come. And that was one reason that we, well, didn't care much about the renewing the long-term contract with Qatar. But when the war on Ukraine by the Russians happened several months later, then the spot market of LNG, well, sparked. And then now we consider that our decision may not have been the best. But the tendency of Japan relying on long-term contracts has been dominant for some more time, basically because we consider that that would provide more security for our energy imports from wherever we are importing from, regardless of being oil or LNG or even coal.
Thanks. Sorry, my internet dropped out just at the end, but I think I got the gist of most of it. So you mentioned that Japan is involved in a few LNG projects in Russia, Sakhalin-2 and the Arctic LNG. How does the country view involvement with those export projects in light of, strategically, in light of also backing Ukraine quite publicly? How do they kind of fit those together and view the outlook, I guess, over the medium long term for those projects?
Yes, the Sakhalin-2 project is running. I mean, it's already completed, and the production is stable. And the only thing is that, well, we have a stake. The Japanese private entities, companies do have a stake, as well as the semi-government institution as well. So we do have the right to import and also buy these LNGs. So we're not trying to, relinquish that sort of a right. At one point, companies like Exxon and Shell have, liquefied these shares that they held once, and then they have just left. Now, Japan, with the vicinity, the proximity, the geographical proximity that we have with Sakhalin, we consider that it is sort of an asset that we need to, keep as long as we can. Of course, it is conditional of how we are going to deal with Russia, given the circumstances, what is happening in the war fronts or war zone in Ukraine. But the Japanese government, at least as I understand, is really adamant in keeping and maintaining the imports of Sakhalin-2 LNGs. Because as I said, it roughly amounts to like 9 to 10% of our total LNG imports. And that is not a joke, and it's not that easy to replace that with some other, producers or exporters or suppliers, regardless of being a long-term contract or trying to procure them in the spot market. The Sakhalin, one more point. But apart from the Sakhalin-2, we are also engaged in the Arctic 2 LNG project. We are not sure whether this is going to, become sort of a successful case for us or not. We may not be able to pick up the LNG that may be produced out from this project.
Oh, interesting. I mean, overall, do you think that Japan's energy supplies are more at risk from geopolitical events and conflict, or is it actually things like accidents and strikes in Australia, which obviously were also causing concern, and quite a lot more reliance on Australia for LNG than anywhere else?
Yes, today the Australians have become the #1 LNG supplier for Japan, and I believe that is going to continue, based again proximity relative proximity to Japan, and also that the terms and contracts are not that rigid as compared to the ones that we held with the Qataris, and that sort of an advantage has made the Japanese to consider that it's better to deal with the Australians than with the Qataris. But the investment was quite a huge one, and the result was that the LNG that we pick up from the Ichthys projects are pricier. I mean, they are priced higher than the ones that we have been picking up from Qatar.
What are the options for diversification for Japan? I mean, you've got 10% coming from Sakhalin. You've got a lot coming from Australia that was threatened with strikes, etc. Are there options? Is there actually anything you can do other than reduce use?
Yes, that's a very interesting and also important question that you raised. Yes, we could divert our LNG imports to other resources, but then the question is where would it come from? Egypt, I mean, sometimes yes, but now that the Tamar gas field is shut down, the project is shut down, Egypt has no LNG to export. That's going to be an issue. Oman does have the LNG, say, facilities, but they themselves are short of gas, and that's going to be another problem. So the other part of the answer to another part of the way, another way to answer the question is just what the government is trying to do: reboot the nuclear power plants so that we may need less LNGs to burn at the thermal power plants, LNG fired, natural gas fired power plants. And that is one reason that the government has been pushing so hard, not only the Kishida administration, even the governments prior to that had in mind of rebooting the power plants, the NPRs. Only problem was that the public was mostly against it, or had concerns over the safety of the facilities, and the people here in Japan were not ready for that. But now it's gradually shifting. Only that the shift is happening so slow, and it may not be enough for the government to finally, say, meet the goals of 2030 or even 2050. And even if we do that, even if we achieve that goal, beyond 2050, there is no strategy that we have in hand of how to maintain how to maintain carbon neutrality beyond 2050.
Yeah, interesting. And I wonder, has electrification played a role in the energy security debate in Japan, like it has in China, for example, where EVs are seen not only as a domestic industry, but also as a strategic instrument for reducing oil demand, and heat pumps are seen as a way of reducing gas demand, and reducing your strategic vulnerability.
Right. Yes. That again is well debated here extensively, but there is no clear-cut answer to that. Yes, we could reduce the reliance on oil for, say, transportation fuel if we turn to EVs or BEVs. That's quite possible. But then again, the issue is now we are running short of power. We are running short of electricity. Now, how are we going to generate electricity? Some talk about, say, windmills, wind farms, offshore wind farms, which sounded quite okay until the Ministry of Defense interfered, of course, of the concerns that it's going to hamper their radar system for national security, which is vital for our national security. And that has become sort of an issue, although the Ministry of Defense has quite quietly mentioned that issue, although I believe it is a major issue when we have a neighbor like DPRK shooting missiles every once in a while over Japan. So the idea of BEV isn't bad, but the answer, the key to the answer is how are we going to generate electricity? And then again, all arrows point to NPRs.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point about radar and offshore wind turbines. I'll have to look into what the UK view of that is, as we are doing similar things, although with less missiles fired across the country. So just quickly before we go to audience questions, I was wondering about the role of coal. So there's still quite a big role for coal in the plants. Obviously, this is something from a decarbonisation view that you might want to target, but from an energy security view, may play quite a role. And as you mentioned, if Japan is short of power, it might not be clear what to do about that. So I was wondering what the role of coal is in Japan's energy security. I mean, I don't know if it comes from Australia or if it's domestically produced, and whether, is there potential to do more to reduce coal usage by 2030, or is it enough of a challenge to get it to 19%?
Okay, this chart I shared with you all during my presentation, the second chart, I mean, the one that is derived from the strategic energy policy of Japan of year 2021, does talk about the reduction of reliance on coal and also LNG. But if we compare that with the other existing states of from the OECD or other G7 countries, it is still a huge or significant number that we are going to have to burn coal. And the only way that is going to, we are trying to alleviate the emission of GHG from the coal-fired power plants, is to combine them with the use of ammonia, or like introducing hydrogen in their combustion. And that is the only way that the government have come up with sort of an answer. And that in turn, or that specifically would mean that we are still going to burn coal. Although we do foresee that is going to reduce, we are going to reduce the amount of the reliance, but still we are going to be heavily dependent on coal. And that is going to continue. And only this year, during the month of June and July, two major coal-fired power plants were newly founded. I mean, they came into line. So that tells of how we are foreseeing our coal industry or coal-fired power plants.
Interesting. So one last, I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry, it's freezing a little bit. One last question just before we go to the questions from the audience, which is that you mentioned that the grid's not synchronous in Japan, and I was wondering why, if you could explain a little bit why that is, especially as interconnection becomes increasingly important for decarbonization, but also for energy security.
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question, or when you were talking about.
Sure. So you mentioned that the two grids, the east and western grids, were not synchronous.
Right. Okay.
So I was wondering why that hadn't been addressed, or what the kind of issues were around that, whether there were plans to address it.
Well, yes, that is kind of an issue that we hold. And I believe that we are the only major country in the world that is faced with that kind of an issue. And even today, there is no way to resolve that, only that there is sort of intermission facility that lies in between that is going to convert the 60 hertz to 50 hertz or vice versa. But that sort of a facility has its own limits. And when the East is supposedly the East is short of power, and the West is generating excess amount of power, only it's like 1 million, 100,000 kilowatt, 1 gigawatts are able to be transferred from West to East. And that sort of a limit that we face over there. And also, there are 4 major islands that constitute the Japanese archipelago. And even beyond, even amongst them, there is only a very thin line that connects these major islands. So the island of Hokkaido, which is in the northern part of Japan, may have excess power, but still they cannot transfer enough power, or the entire amount of excess power to the Tohoku region or the mainland of Japan, where city of Tokyo lies. And the same applies to the island of Kyushu. And during summer times, they have an overcapacity of solar PVs. that enables the entire island to run solely during daytime, solely by solar PVs. And even beyond that, they need to shut down power plants, LNG fired power plants, and so on and so forth. But then again, the line that connects the Kyushu Island to the Honshu Island, which is the main island, has its own limits. And then again, they may not be able to utilize it 100%. So again comes the question of how to use that sort of an excess amount of energy power. And one answer is to either transform them to another style of energy, store them in a way, like in battery cells, or find some other medium that could enable the transfer of energy from one location to the other. So hydrogen and ammonia, these kinds of things come into play if the facility is adequate enough. But we still haven't invested in that sort of a facility. There is no major facility that generates hydrogen or ammonia in an industrial level for that kind of a use.
Cool. Thanks for that. Sounds like interconnection may be a priority, or perhaps ought to be. Well, thank you very much, Professor Tanaka, and thank you everybody.
You're welcome.
For thank you to the audience for attending and to Foundation for organizing the event. I think it was an interesting conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed the talks. Thank you.